Oliver Kite was a master fly fisherman, naturalist, writer, broadcaster, professional soldier. He was also, in all the important senses of the word, a gentleman. His untimely death in June 1968, when he was only 47 and in the prime of his life, came as a profound shock to the millions who looked forward to his weekly television programs about his fishing experiences and his beloved countryside. His program, Kite's Country, knew no boundaries. It embraced seashores, lonely moors, bustling cities, even an oil refinery. It stretched wherever he happened to roam. But there was always one important characteristic, an almost hypnotic fascination for the wildlife and the plants, a fascination that was highlighted by his remarkable powers of observation. Ollie, as he was affectionately known, was a naturalist from his youth, and as a lover of the countryside, he knew the birds and animals by name and by habit. When one walked or fished with him, he made the whole countryside come alive. Not even the shyest of creatures would escape his pleasure or his attention. His keen blue eyes, that had once looked for Japs in the Burma jungle, could equally seek out the trout that lay hiding amongst the weed bars. As Major Kite, he retired from the army in 1965 after a quarter of a century as a regular officer. But a serious illness some 8 years earlier had caused him to change his sword for the pen. For the army, he rewrote the infantry manuals. He also became a prolific and popular writer in leading fishing and country magazines. He was an authority on dry fly and nymph fishing, and was acknowledged as such by notable fishermen throughout the world. Watch now as he takes one of his last trout from this delightful stretch of chalk stream, the top of the Test, his Rolls-Royce River, as he called it. It was here that Ollie died, while fishing, only a few days later. Ollie enjoyed not only his fishing, but also his surroundings, the wildlife, the plants and the scenery. He took a protective, almost possessive interest in the creatures he studied, and incredibly, they always seemed to appear wherever he went. He made more than 200 appearances on television, and his gentle voice and deep knowledge of the countryside endeared him to millions of viewers in the south of England. It was the rest of the country's loss that his programs were not shown nationally. One viewer wrote to him that he regretted that in a few weeks he would be leaving the area and would not be able to see many more of Ollie's programs. The writer was awaiting release from Parkhurst Prison. Some excerpts from his programs have survived, and although back in the 60s television was still in black and white, Ollie's inspired descriptions added their own special kind of luster. To those who knew Oliver Kite, It is hoped that this film will bring back some pleasant memories, and to those who did not, may it surprise and delight them.
The tiny village of Fisherton-Delamere lies just downstream of the 2-mile Wiley fishery that I've looked after since 1957. And June for me is weed cutting time, that very thirsty time of the year, when I'm glad to start the day by tethering a bottle of my homemade wine in the Fisherton Mill stream. Because for 14 days every June I go down to Fisherton-Delamere, park my car and work hard all day tending the fishery, cutting the weed, making it absolutely right for the fishermen. A young robin watching me, his spotted breast betraying his age, and the martins collecting mud at the water's edge for their nests in the old mill itself. And from this bridge beside the old mill I normally start my day, having put on my long and very hot waders and got out my scythe, blunted perhaps from the previous day's labour. This weed cutting is an essential task in midsummer each year, at least on this river. There are various reasons why it has to be undertaken, some purely functional, some purely aesthetic. For one thing, if you didn't cut the weed, there'd be a tendency of the river level to go too high, for the banks to be eroded by overflow. And for another thing, if you didn't open up some of the weed, it'd be very difficult for fishermen to put a fly on the water. And so there is a combination of reasons. Round about June the 10th I begin as a rule, and I carry on until June the 24th, when by a sort of gentleman's agreement in Wiltshire we try and stop weed cutting and allow the river to settle down once again. And when you go out on a June day, a long day that very often starts as early as 7 in the morning and may not finish until close on dark, there are so many things to captivate you and to interest you that at times it's difficult to really get on with the work. You may recognize the damselfly there. It's one of the most beautiful to be seen on our chalk streams at this midsummer period. The black band on the wings of this male tells you it is the banded agrion. So much different in colour, the blue male, to the rather drab and greenish female with her clear wings. Brightly coloured too are the many different snails that you find in the water herbage along the river bank itself. Herbage which I shall have to trim off before this job of weed cutting is finally completed. And there are snails in the water too. Snails, if you have time to study them, are a fascinating subject. Today, I'm afraid, we've no time for such things. We must get on with the job in hand. June is a flower-decked month, largely a white month in my experience. White butterflies, white elder blossom on the hedgerows, white moon daisies among the long grasses, and the small daisies on the unkept lawns if you leave them for a day or two at this time of the year. And everywhere the wild rose binds its garland on the lovely brow of May. In the water itself, the white flowers of the water buttercup, the ranunculus, which is the weed I'm mostly concerned with in this fishery management business. And this ranunculus is eaten by, among other things, swans and their cygnets. I'm not fond of swans as a fisherman. I've many reasons for disliking them. They make a mess on the riverbank. I'm afraid they very often disturb the fish on a fishing day, but who can deny they make a charming picture here on the river in the lovely warm sunshine of a June morning. On a blazing June day, there's something very cool about the water pouring in through these boiling hatch pools. And everywhere throughout the length of the fishery, the mallard now have their ducklings, varying in size from literally just out of the egg to birds plump enough to be suggestive already of the green peas fattening in my garden. The charming companion I see so much of every day, the water vole, is a harmless creature. He makes holes in the bank, it's true, but he's very much a vegetarian and in no way related to the rat, with which he's often confused. The water vole, not a water rat. Some of the ducks have been thinned out, I'm afraid, by the odd feral mink, which have already strayed into the Wylye Valley. Water voles don't see very well, but when you get really close to them, once they can focus and decide you are there, they'll take off and move very swiftly indeed. The noise of the river is a very pleasant accompaniment to weed cutting, because make no mistake about it, this really is laborious business, and from time to time one can envy the young fishermen finding something perhaps rather more interesting at the waterside. A little sadly, I must confess, it's time we broke this spell and got down to the rather more prosaic business of actually cutting the weed. The thick ranunculus tresses which already cover the river almost from bank to bank. And let no one be in any doubt that this weed cutting job really is hard labour. And in these hot chest waders, which are essential when the water very often runs right up almost to within an inch of the top, it's very warm work indeed. And the shorn ranunculus tresses drift away in the bright June sunshine and themselves make interesting patterns on the water surface. And where I've revealed them, a shoal of immature minnows playing on the golden gravel. And a caddis, its case composed of quite heavy gravel particles, which of course help to tether it, so to speak, in the fast current. From these caddis grubs the sedge flies come that haunt the midsummer nights, and a pair of shrimps, one carrying the other, swift movers, and the ugly, squat black nymph of the beautiful yellow May dun. My sunglasses help me to see into the depths, and now a really big crayfish has been exposed and is seeking for shelter, a creature of the night, a scavenger, and this is a really big adult for this river, something like 6 inches long and capable of giving you a really sharp nip with those big lobster pincers. A fearsome creature to behold in close-up. Tiny sedge warbler with a beak full of food. Her nest is just in the sedges at the water's edge, where in the shade a frog takes his ease and regards me with a seemingly malevolent stare, glaring to the burning midsummer sun, beating down on the water. And that's why I wear these sunglasses when I'm weed cutting. I'd never dream of wearing them when I'm fishing. I don't like the advantage it gives me through being able to see in the water. I'd rather take fish on their own terms. That's a purely personal feeling. I never tell other people they should think like that. And already the weed bars begin to take shape at the far end of the reach. It's a very satisfying thing to tend a river, as I've tended this one these 8 years past, and to see it taking shape at weed cutting time and looking so nice for the fishermen whom I try to serve. A river really is in some ways like a garden, or you wouldn't think so to see this uncut reach where the martins dip and the swallows play, and the moorhens search among the watercress for their food. A little white tail flickering. Well, my labour for the day having ended, I thought it would be tremendous fun to try and catch a trout for my supper, and spotting quite a good fish, because the trout on this part of the Wylye don't run big. A pound is exceptional, 3/4 of a pound, a good fish. Spotting a trout, I thought I'd have him out. He wasn't rising, but I'd no doubt a little nymph would do the trick. A bare hook with just a bit of wire on it to make it sink. The problem is, of course, to put the nymph precisely in front of the trout so that I can just lift it in the water and make him take, the famous induced take of the nymph fisherman. Let's try it now. As the nymph drifts down at the fish's level, just lift it in front of him. There it is. He's on. Straight away, he runs hard for the ranunculus upstream. We hold him back and we turn him, and a lot of the steam goes out of him in that first unsuccessful rush. Get the net under him quickly before he starts to go again. I don't want to hang about here pandering to fish at this time of an evening. Beautifully spotted trout of the wily, all wild fish. There's no artificial stocking in these parts. No rainbows, nothing, just the trout. We don't even get pike up in this water. A few grayling, that's all. And now the tiny nymph on which the fish was taken. Lower it down there in salute. One's enough for any man for his supper. And what I like to do to accompany that trout is to find myself a wild salad at the waterside, a few sprigs of watercress. There, some beautiful ragged robin. Passing now a lovely wild orchis. These wild orchis abound in this water meadow. And at last some dandelion leaves that make a succulent salad. Just carry a bit of salt in the boot of your car, something to cook a fish in, and you've got a meal there to remember for the rest of your days. What time is it? High time. High time for supper. And that tiny little stove enables me to cook a trout in no time at all with a minimum of fuss. Put out the stove, settle down on the cushion, pneumatic cushion given me by my Danish friends when I fished over there in Jutland last year, and start my supper. And believe me, at this time, 7 o'clock in the evening, having been on the job for 12 hours, I feel I've earned it. I almost forgot that cooled wine which I'd taken from the mill stream a moment or two before. Let's open it now. Sparkling elderflower wine. Kite's champagne. And so to end yet another June day, a day of labour and beauty and fun. I think this arrow marks the precise spot where I was born, where the white owl came and sat on my mother's bed and watched the performance. And in its place, a great road now runs between Newport and Cardiff. Opposite, some of the old landmarks remain, the Wesleyan Chapel, but minus the tall and graceful spire that I always associated with it. Next door, the police station, down below the field where we used to play football. But on this side, all the houses, the shop, the inn, all had vanished. I had a job to get my bearings, although I was standing on the spot where our front lawn used to be. I began to wonder, indeed, if I'd even find anyone there who could tell me anything about it. I remembered that opposite there used to live a family whose name was Perrott, and an old man emerged from his garden, and thinking this might be Arthur Perrott, I went over to him. Recognition was slow on his part, but at last he carried his mind back 30 years and, of course, remembered me. And there in front of the Baptist chapel where the swifts used to scream in summer, we discussed some of the people I knew there before I left 30 years ago. Behind our house, the castle still stands, and the fountain where they put the roach when the mill pool was emptied. But many other old familiar landmarks were no longer to be found. In these circumstances, of course, it's not easy to get your bearings. And on then to the village church where 3 generations of my family have their last resting place. In this church are commemorated 3 of my father's brothers who were slain in battle in South Africa, in France and Flanders. Here too my only brother lies, and there the grave of my father himself. a few yards away, across the daisy-studded turf, my grandparents, who brought me up, have their last resting place. And the old sexton's cottage across the churchyard has long since tumbled into ruin. But a few yards across the path is a bay tree, and the leaves I found are as fragrant as when I first knew them 40-odd years ago. My father had a sister who lies here, and two of her grandchildren, knowing that I was in the churchyard, came shyly to meet me, and together we walked around the farm by the church, which stands almost as it were on an island in this very low-lying country beside the Bristol Channel. Much of it indeed is below sea level, and a great sea wall protects it. I always remember this place as being alive with dogs and chickens, and the familiar landmark of the old wagons there took my mind way back. Familiar sights and sounds and smells made me feel that I was rereading the pages of some almost forgotten diary. Well, I'd come to Monmouthshire to fish, and my headquarters, the livery and bait stables at the sign of the Three Salmons in the Usk Valley. I look forward to opening day every year and try and make it a different river each time. My first job to collect my permit from the fishing tackle shop, and the badge of the Welsh Fly Fishers Association on the car of my old friend Lionel Sweet, its president. He was just, in fact, setting off to fish for salmon himself. My quarry on this day, trout, a magpie, one for sorrow, a bad sign at the start of a fishing day. But this is something we can rectify in an old and traditional way by pouring out a generous libation of whiskey and consigning it to the Usk. First of all, O Usk, deliver up thy trout. All we ask is a brace. And now, coats off, opening day, let's get down to business. And the first fly, an early brown appropriately enough, crawls down the hairs of my bare forearm. And that's the fly I'm waiting for, the March brown, normally an April fly, but this year hatching very early. And when the March browns appear on the surface of the water, very soon the trout show some interest. And the great thing is to be ready for them when they begin to rise. Now the Usk is a big and strong river, rises in Carmarthenshire and flows out into the Bristol Channel at Newport. And you've got to be very careful on the boulder-strewn bed of this stream, because in this strong current, if you lost your footing, I think you'd be in some peril. And it so happened that most of the trout were rising way over under that far bank, a longish cast. And it called for careful balance on my part to avoid falling into the water and being swept away. I had expected a different fly to be on the water on this day, but the fish took my imperial readily enough as they were feeding on the March browns. Big, dark, mottled flies, March browns. We don't get them in Wiltshire at all, because they hatch only in waters with a stony bed. My first trout was fighting gamely, considering the earliness of the season, surprisingly strongly. And in that very heavy water, when the fish got below me, I had to be very careful how I coaxed it up towards me and the net. Otherwise, the fly could easily have pulled free of the fish. I'm hoping now, any moment, to net my first trout of the 1966 season. And there it is, a fish only an ounce or so short of a pound. Much better fish than the average for this water. Hunting country this, and hunters being exercised from time to time on this lovely sunny opening day. The March brown hatches in flurries. They don't continue to come up in any sustained way. A few will appear, and then 10 minutes you see nothing at all. The fish seem to go right off the rise. Then perhaps another flurry. And in the fields hard by, many newborn lambs. These Welsh mountain sheep lamb a lot earlier than our grass sheep do in Wiltshire. And there, among the lambs, a carrion crow was walking, apparently causing them very little concern. Hunting, I think, for insects, probably for once doing some good. Well, I was anxious to try and make up a brace of trout if I could, and when the March browns came up again in a second flurry, I worked hard to try and interest a fish rising upstream. Before very long, my fly came over him along with two natural flies, and he picked out my artificial, much to my satisfaction. This fish, too, fought hard, though not quite as big as the earlier one. A fish more like the Usk average, round about 10 or 11 ounces. Well, that gave me my brace, the opening brace of the season. Time to toast them. Good health and yachida. From my village, I enter the city of Salisbury via Castle Road, where an old rookery has survived in the middle of the built-up area. Now, in the early spring, before the trees actually break leaf, if you study a rookery, I think you'll find it both interesting and instructive, because the old rooks, although they're rather scruffy birds in many ways, are rather comical too. And like human beings, there are rogues among them as well as saints. Now, one of the things I notice about rooks is that given half a chance, they never hesitate to steal from each other. That one on the nest on the left there now is actually stealing soft dried grass or hay or some such material used by another pair to line their nest. Now the other one will go in and help himself. It works out about even in the end, I think, because while they're away, their nest too will probably be pillaged by some of their neighbours. And beneath the rookery, in the chimney pots of the houses, a great many jackdaws have been building their nests. And I think some of the good citizens of Castle Road may well have a bit of a surprise coming when they set a light to their fires when the first cold days come in the autumn. Because jackdaws can pack an astonishing amount of material, twigs and sticks and all that sort of thing, into these chimney pots, filling up the whole chimney cavity if necessary before they are satisfied with the nest they make. What a beak that old rook has got on him. I was fortunate to have a rather nice sunny day for my visit to the city, and to give the city gardeners their due, the spring flower beds really are a wonderful sight there. I'd like to take this opportunity of paying a personal tribute to them. Now, being a Tuesday, it was also market day, and I very much enjoy a walk round Salisbury Market. Salisbury Market is of great antiquity, and in many ways I don't suppose it's changed a lot down the centuries. I'm sure a lot of the things they sell here today have been sold here for generations. There are new things, of course, and the people, though they may dress differently, basically are the same quiet, friendly crowd you always meet in Salisbury on a midweek market day. One of the things I look forward to when I visit the market in Salisbury is a dish of cockles, because living 40-odd miles from the sea, I don't often get an opportunity to eat fresh cockles, and what a wonderfully good 4-penny worth it is when you consider that people have had to go to the shore, dig for the cockles, collect them, scrub them, boil them, shell them, serve them up with pepper and vinegar. Then I think this is a wonderfully economic sort of appetizer to be able to get, and I really enjoy them. By the Long Bridge, which is a favourite observation post of mine, it's quite astonishing the variety of bird life that you can see at this wonderful viewpoint. It's from hereabouts, of course, that Constable painted his famous view of the cathedral, and the cathedral jackdaws collect their nesting material here along the banks of the river. This is a favourite place too with the black-headed gulls, some of them possibly non-breeding birds this year. because on the shallows they are able to find the fish which they like to hunt at this time of the year. And in the heat haze, out in the water meadow there near the cathedral, was a common gull, which despite its name is in fact the least common of the gulls which visit us here in the city of Salisbury. And already the red shank are beginning to come inland. In the winter, if you remember, we used to see them about the estuaries and mud flats and the shoreline. But in the spring, they come using the river valleys as migration routes to nest with us in the water meadows in our county of Wiltshire. Greenfinch up there in the tree. Cree keeps crying. That's the typical spring call of the greenfinch. The note of the red shank decidedly mournful, something terribly sad about it, I think. And from the long bridge, a last look now at the activity in the water that afternoon, dominated by the spawning grayling, which, although relatives of the salmon and trout, unlike those fish which spawn in winter, the grayling spawn in April at the same time as many coarse fish. Beautiful thing to watch. One of the most colourful corners of Wiltshire at lilac time is the valley of the Lower Ebble, between Coombe Bisset, which stands on the main road from Salisbury to Blandford, and Nunton, quite near the main southward road from Salisbury to Bournemouth. It's not a great distance to walk. You can cover it easily in a few hours and leave yourself with plenty of time to explore en route. I began my explorations in Coombe Bisset, watched by a pied wagtail, and the first place I called at, the rhododendrons were in full flower, and particularly fragrant rhododendrons these. And as you might expect, at this time of the year, they were proving very attractive indeed to the wild bees. Let us, for a moment or two now, join the wild bees and enjoy together the scents and sights and sounds of lilac time. In a hedgerow, not very far away, a hen thrush was brooding her eggs, and the cockbird so obviously proud of it that he was moved to utter a few phrases of song there in the damp grass. There'd been a bit of a shower early in the morning, but I think at this time of the year the wild green earth smells all the fresher for it, and so too do the flowers, and in the warm sunshine the bluebells will soon dry their tears. Nice to see the wildflowers along the way, as well as the lilac and the rhododendrons and all the rest that adorn the cottage gardens for which these villages are so renowned. I crossed the channel, as I usually do, by the very efficient car ferry from Southampton to Le Havre, and as we approached the French coast, the tricolour was run up, and the kindly Norwegian master Captain Muller invited me to join him on his bridge and watch him bring the ship in. The French have done a wonderful job of rebuilding at Le Havre, for this port was very badly knocked about indeed during the last war. Well, although there'd been a force 8 gale during the night, we docked bang on time. And about 80 miles to the east, near the great city of Rouen, is the tiny Norman village of Rie, where I made my headquarters. Rie stands on a little river called the Crevant, which is itself a tributary of the river I'd come to fish, the river Andelle. The Andelle itself is a direct tributary of the Seine, and I offloaded my bags at the little inn where I normally stay during my fishing visits to this part of Normandy. The Crevant, I was a little disappointed to see, was beginning to get rather discoloured, and I wasn't at all certain what I would find when I got to the Andelle a few miles away. The Andelle is a chalk stream and normally flows crystal clear like our chalk streams in Wiltshire and Hampshire. But on this day it was very dark and wet, and it looked as though they'd had rain earlier in the week. However, the river itself wasn't too bad, not exactly crystal clear, but certainly fishable, and quite early in the morning the fish were rising. Now this water is preserved by my very good friend Dr. Yves Jean-Marie Marcel Rameau, with whom, as many of you know, I have fished in very many rivers, both in this country and in Europe. And usually at this time of the year I go across to Normandy to join him on one of his waters for the mayfly season. This year, I'm afraid, the mayfly was very late in Normandy, but that didn't stop us enjoying some good sport, for small flies were hatching, the trout were rising, and it wasn't very long before my first fish came to the bank. We very rarely kill a trout here in Normandy. We've come for the sport, and with the quickest expeditions possible, I wet my hand, release the trout unharmed. The Normandy cattle here are very typical, and in this lush grass they produce about 6 gallons of milk a day, full of that cream which is the very foundation of Norman cooking. Now, as the morning went by, so the rain got worse, and I was beginning to wish I had something to cover my head, something of the sort the doctor was wearing, a sort of monkish cowl, because by this time the water was beginning to get down my neck, and the doctor's wet hands caused that trout to jump clean from them. He wasn't, in fact, throwing it into the river. No more gentle fellow could be imagined. Well, it came lunchtime, and the rain by now was very heavy indeed, and it's not easy to have a picnic in these sort of conditions. Even the swallows seem to be getting rather fed up with it, though these wet conditions very often produce a very good hatch of fly which suits both them and us. We decided to make the best of a bad job and eat our picnic standing up, getting what shelter we could from the cider apple trees, which are such a feature of this part of Normandy. The Normandy cattle again, typical spectacle markings around the eyes. The Norman herd book was started in 1883, and the cattle can't qualify for that herd book unless they've got those typical marks around the eyes. And all through our rather damp luncheon period, the flies continued to hatch and the birds were down on the water. That's what the fly fisher likes to see. And the doctor finishing his lunch with a good wedge of camembert, which of course is produced here in Normandy. The flies hatching this day were blue-winged olives, olives, and it is a fact that when blue-winged olives are on the water and trout take them, they are generally pretty easy to catch. And so we were expectant of even better sport after lunch, always provided the water didn't discolour too much. Well, now it was the turn of my host, Dr. Yves Rameau, and he is acknowledged to be one of the best fly fishers in all France, as I think you'll see for yourselves now. Already he's made contact with his first fish, and this one proved to be a very lively one indeed. We were fishing on this day at a place called Morville, which is fairly high up the River Ondelle, and the trout there don't run as heavy as they do lower down, but nevertheless they are very beautiful and strong fish. This one probably just under a pound. Sometimes you get them rather bigger than that. I remember when I was there a year ago, I had 9 the first day, all more or less about a pound weight, which is a very handy size for wild brown trout. And when Rameau fishes, he does so with the most tremendous panache and enthusiasm. And there's something infectious about this. I find when I'm fishing with him that we always seem to get the most tremendous fun out of the game. And once again, he has taken his fish at the very first cast. The rain had got very bad by this time, and the river was rising and beginning to pick up quite a lot of old rubbish, leaves and things like that from along the banks. Nice fish now, close on a pound and a half in weight. And in these sort of conditions, when the river gets dirty and messy, there's a danger that the fishing may suffer. In fact, what happened was the fish stopped rising altogether, although the flies continued to hatch. They sickened, I suppose, by that rather dirty water. And then, as by a miracle, the sun came out really hot, and we were able to get rid of some of our sodden things and hang them up to dry. Well, I had little hope of the fishing improving as a result of this change in the weather. But there were things to be seen by the waterside. I hoped to catch a glimpse of a muskrat, and I got a very close view of a typical Norman bull. And again you'll see those characteristic spectacle marks around the eyes. I wasn't taking too many chances with this chap. In the heat of the afternoon, a few mayflies did hatch, but although we watched them for a long time, we never saw one taken by a fish. So as a mayfly expedition, this didn't come off. Next morning, I made ready to leave the village of Ries for my next port of call in Anjou. But before leaving the inn, I went and had a last look at the little river Crevant, where there's a statue of a boy fishing in the river. And there I was delighted to get what must be the very best view I've ever had of a muskrat, an animal we don't have here, and it's very nearly as big as a cat. And I leave you now with a wonderfully detailed view of this little mammal. You need 3 things, I think, for a day's blackberrying. Plenty of blackberry bushes with a good crop of fruit, a stick with a crooked handle to enable you to get at the fruit, and finally a basket to put them in. A mushroom basket makes a very good container. And keep your eyes open when you are out blackberrying, because otherwise you'll miss a great deal of interest. Be very selective in how you pick the fruit. I myself don't pick any blackberries until they've got properly black. On the other hand, I don't pick any that look as if they're rather past their best. They get a sort of a dark velvety bloom on them when they reach that stage, and they also feel soft to the touch. Leave them for the insects to enjoy. You see, blackberries get attacked by various creatures, and once the skin has been penetrated, creatures like flies and even moths can come and drink from the fruit. Now, some people will wear gloves when they're picking blackberries. I don't myself. I just take care how I pick the fruit, because those hook thorns can be very sharp indeed. The willow herb now going to seed. And a lovely red admiral butterfly on the willow herb flowers. I've seen a great many red admirals during the past week. It's nice to pick blackberries on a fine sunny day, because I think if the fruit are wet, there's a great danger of them being a bit on the mildew side. So I like to have a good sunny, dry day if I'm going blackberrying. Now, I line my basket incidentally with foil there, so that it doesn't become impregnated with the juice. That again tends to produce mildew if you allow this to happen. Well, it's not a bad thing at the start of the day to secrete something cool to drink, and then if you make your way back to the starting point by lunchtime, you can collect your picnic and something to wash it down with. And I've brought along some rough cider in an old Wiltshire Harvest bottle, and this is something that I like to have with me on a day like this. The pottery keeps the cider very cool indeed, especially if you leave it in the shade at the time you start out in the morning. Well, my wife, I've no doubt, has put me up a very tasty picnic. We'll come to that in a minute. First things first. Rough cider, the stuff they call scrumpo or stunham, a little bit sharp but wonderfully thirst quenching. Let's turn our attention now to the picnic basket and the modest viands we've brought out for the day. Hard work this, and man needs to restore his failing tissues. Half a cold roast fowl, some fresh salad from my own garden, and something to dress it with. I make the dressing myself before I leave home. It's a simple vinaigrette dressing of 3 parts oil to 1 of vinegar, a little mustard and some pepper and salt, and to tart up the salad there, a bit of green pepper. Dress it now with that vinaigrette and just toss the salad gently so that it's all properly in contact with the dressing. Again, at lunchtime, this is the time to keep your eyes open, because a great deal can be happening all round you and you don't want to miss it. A close relative of the water vole, this is the bank vole, a little chap who lives in the grasses. He likes undergrowth. The other vole, the short-tailed vole, is more a creature of the open plain and the grass. And it's creatures like that that the kestrel is looking for. The squirrel has his harvest at this time of the year, the acorn harvest. And there are a good many squirrels about on this day, not taking very much notice of me, I may say. Well, with this basket of mine still only half full, I had to get on, because it holds altogether some 6 pounds of blackberries, and by the time I came into lunch, I reckon I had no more than 3. Around about mid-afternoon, I reckon, I got 6 pounds of fruit, and I was delighted to see the speckled wood come down and indulge in this little pirouetting dance on my basket, the Dolce Vita. Altogether, there are 7 lakes on this property, and this one is called Chalky Pool. It's one of the smallest of the lakes here, and at this spot the reed mace grows beautifully, heavy with pollen at this time of the year. Only later, towards autumn, does it take on that typical appearance of what most people call bulrushes. Alex grows a lot of trees hereabouts, and in consequence the place is a great favourite with many arboreal birds. He gets woodpeckers here, and a lot of the smaller singing birds as well, like the chiffchaff. They'll go on singing now until well into the autumn, when most of them leave us for the winter. And here is one of his seedling little fir trees, and beneath it a tiny frog. At a time when frogs are getting very scarce indeed, it's good to know they still breed here in appreciable numbers. When Alex first came here, there were only 2 legs. He's developed it up to the point of having 7. Some nice fungus there growing on dead timber, and it's near the dead timber that we hope to find the stag beetle, because the larvae of this formidable-looking insect actually lives in dead wood, a little grebe. They produce round about 3 broods a year on the big lakes here as a rule. Now, I'm not a dog man myself, but I'm told by people who profess to know that only Alsatians and their mongrels bite the water in this curious way. This big dog, Butch, must be the terror of poachers for miles around. The orchids love this damp soil around here, and there's quite a variety in their proper season. Spotted orchis there. Well, Alex has imported some Japanese larches which grow very quickly indeed, and in the space of 7 years, from about 1959, his Japanese larches have gone right up to about 30 feet high and left behind the Scotch firs alongside. And at this point there's a very big old dead tree which I decided to search very carefully through my glasses, and here at last I found the thing we'd hoped to see, the stag beetle. This, of course, the male. They generally say when they come out this time of the year, it's a sign of fine hot weather, so I hope that's true. We could do with some. Well, it was then that Alex drew my attention to this so-called uncatchable trout living in a little arm of the home pool, a pool that's not been stocked these 2 years past. Some willow herb beside this pool is the food plant of the elephant hawk moth, a rather reddish insect, quite a large moth, though not one of the largest of our hawk moths. And you may well see these about in the south where there's willow herb, a tall, reddish flowered plant that's so plentiful in many parts. Blue tits have their nest down a pipe. A lot of people ask me why or how tits ever manage to get their young out of a vertical pipe if the nest is right down in the bottom of it. The answer is, of course, the young crawl up inside. They've very, very sharp claws that enable them to do this. Well, Alex invited me to have a go at this allegedly uncatchable trout, a big fish that lives in that far arm of the home pool. And he said a lot of people had tried to catch it, but it had no luck at all, because the trout had been there a very long time and had got used to all the artificial flies. So it seemed to me my one chance would be to try and deceive it with something it had never seen before, and I put my faith in a bare hook, just a little bit of wire on it to make it sink and suggest the thorax of a nymph. Pied wagtails there, they've had a nest near one of Alex's rearing pools and now brought off their young. The house martins still busy with their young farther along under the eaves. Well, I was rather encouraged by the fact that while I'd been wiring that hook, I had seen, or thought I'd seen, a fish move somewhere over at that far end of the home pool. And as I approached, sure enough, the fish rose again. And I was very encouraged by the size of this trout. Well, it seemed to me if I was going to get this fish, I'd probably have to go first time. And very, very carefully I cast under the low, overhanging trees. And suddenly I saw the fish turn towards my nymph, saw its mouth open as it took, and had no difficulty at all in setting the hook. It was then that my difficulties really began, because the fish ran very hard indeed down into that arm, and of course I was much hampered by the trees and had the greatest difficulty in managing to keep the tight line without having it foul against the tree trunks and snap. At last, I managed to get the fish on a fairly short line, and then I had to hold him and take the steam out of him without my rod tip fouling the branches overhead, and this again presented me with many problems. This, I noticed, was a brown trout, a big brown, probably been in that pool for some years and had grown on from a very, very tiny fish that had first been turned in there. One of the last of the fish left in this pool, I imagine, and certainly, by the size of him, one of the biggest. And of course, a fish like this is very strong and fights long and hard. Back in April, I had a fish in this pool that weighed 3 pound 4, and that one took me 12 minutes to bring to the net. Well, this one was appreciably bigger and was taking even longer to subdue. Fish fighting mostly on the surface, not making a lot of attempt to get down into weed. It's that can often defeat you at this time of the year when the weed growth is thick in the water. But of course, although he wasn't running away from me, he was giving me the very devil of a job to get him over my big net. At last, we succeeded, and I have an idea I was as tired as the fish himself when I finally got him out. And I really think this is the most beautiful brown trout I've ever caught anywhere. Not perhaps quite the biggest, but certainly the best conditioned, the strongest and deepest. His weight, 3 pounds 15 and a half ounces. Call him 315. And I'll say goodbye.